I do not often watch much television. A few weeks ago, though, I happened to be having a free evening, and I flipped through and watched a show that I kind of got hooked on because I ended up going and watching the Spectrum on demand and trying to catch up on about 6 or 7 other episodes of it. It was very engaging. It was very much one that I could say, wow, I can relate to this in some way. And it's on Tuesday nights. It's called, the show is This Is Us. Don't know if you've ever seen it or not. I'd say a lot of people probably have. Maybe depending upon where you're at in life, you may have more of an interest in it than someone in a different place in life. Not sure it's for little ones, definitely for more teenagers and above is what I would say. If you're not familiar with it, it's a story of family life and a family that has 3 children. They're kind of triplets, but they are tracked now as adults, but there's flashbacks back to their childhood, a lot of flashbacks. And it kind of shows us, and it proves, and it shows how to the viewer that our adult life is very formed by our childhood and by how we were treated as children, and also what happened in our families. So this family has the 3 children. They're now adults, but we see them as children, as teenagers, and then as adults. So I think that it really talks about real life. It's a show that I would say is not based on the bizarre. Sometimes TV shows have something very surreal or unreal about them. It's kind of organic, and I think that's what's attractive about it. It's not that it is something that's like spaceships landing, and I hope they don't get there, because if they do, it's going to ruin it. Because the beauty of this is it's real life. So I've watched a few more, and I would say it's not 100% Catholic teaching. I'm going to give you a little bit of an alert on that, but I don't think anything coming from Hollywood would be 100% Catholic teaching. However, it gives us some messages about some things in life that we deal with. One of them being grief and loss. Talks about how the father dies when the kids are teenagers. How does that now affect them as adults? It addresses anxiety and stress and how that really affects people's lives. One of the children, now an adult, he has an emotional breakdown. How does the family deal with that? What has been kind of causing that through the years? There's a beautiful message of life in there, because there was a scene, and it was kind of a tearjerker, where the mom is pregnant she's got 3 babies in her womb, and she sits and she's talking to them. So today, on this Pro-Life Sunday, this Respect Life Month that we begin, I think it's a good reminder that we remember life begins in the womb. It begins there. And that conversation, that monologue that she has with her babies, it was just very beautiful, very, very heartfelt. I would hope that all mothers would talk to their children in the womb, just to really recognize that they can start knowing your voice. But it also speaks about marriage, and this marriage is not a perfect marriage between the lead characters, but it does reflect forgiveness, self-sacrifice, and love. And something that I noticed in this particular show is how the couple, the parents, they're not afraid to show that they love each other. And I think so often in marriage and in family life, our children and grandchildren, they look at marriage, and all they can think about with marriage is that people fight, that they argue, and that they bicker. And that's kind of what they remember. That's what we see. But in this particular depiction, it shows more about how marriage is something where you can show love and you can show joy, and that we have a responsibility to show that to our children. Because if you're 25 or 30 years old and you're not married and you're thinking about entering into a relationship, but all you've been surrounded by is arguing, you're probably like, why do I want to do that? You'd be kind of cautious about it. Today, our readings focus on relationship and talk about that gift of marriage. It talks about how, first and foremost, marriage is one of the most unique relationships. It's interesting to note here, this is only like the 2nd chapter of Genesis, and we're hearing about the relationship between man and woman, and that relationship is to give the gift of life. And so we hear that in Genesis because it doesn't talk about right away the relationship between teacher and student or king and people or friend to friend. It talks about that relationship of family life. And so we know that John Paul II, St. John Paul II, he had said that marriage is the primordial sacrament. Well, I'll translate that now for you. It means that marriage is like the first. It's like so much else is based upon marriage. Really everything else, because it comes really right at that moment of creation. We hear about how a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. So there's a superiority in this relationship that's different than employer and employee, than between friends, than between siblings. God is giving permission here to say, leave mom and dad and cling to your wife. She is your number one responsibility. And for the women, your husband is your number one responsibility outside of God. This is a special and unique relationship. The vows that are exchanged right here, week after week, are called to be faithful, that the people who are saying yes to those vows, entering into that covenant, are called to fidelity. So, second of all, what we hear about marriage is that it is not only a unique relationship, but it is a vocation. You know, something that we always talk about is vocations. It's great to have Adam with us here. We say, pray for religious vocations. Do you know what? We have to pray for marriage. We need to pray more for marriages, because marriage is a call from God. Just like I felt called to be a priest, and I'm going to tell you that this is not a scandalous statement, but I'm married. I have a spouse. She's 2,000 years old, and she's beautiful. She's beautiful. She's the church. So I can relate to you in your marriage because I also have a marriage of sorts, a little different. But it is that fidelity, that being based on Christ, that I hope is in not just my marriage to the church, as Christ was bonded to the church, but also in your marriage. And since it is a vocation, it means that it's not just a private relationship. Years ago, there was a song, it was played at my brother's wedding. I remembered it was Just You and I. And we think about a couple, and so often we think about couples that they are just the two of them, sitting on a park bench, whispering sweet nothings. Oh, isn't that wonderful? But marriage is a public relationship. You wear a wedding ring. I hope it's shiny. I hope it looks as good today as it did the day that you gave it to your spouse. Because it's something that we have to work on as a vocation. It's something that has to be cared for, something that has to be tended. And so marriage is that vocation from God. Again, we go back to that word fidelity, being faithful to one another. And how important that fidelity is. And that brings me to the third point of marriage, that it mimics humanity. And that means that not every marriage is made in heaven. And that we as people have our own flaws, our own weaknesses, our own brokenness. And we bring that into our relationship, especially in that relationship of marriage. And that's why some marriages, they're very hard. And it is a lot of work. And there's brokenness in marriage. I don't think there's any family that has not been affected in some way by divorce. It is painful. I often think about at a wedding, sometimes people cry, and I don't think they cry because the people are getting married or they don't like the person that they're marrying. I think they cry because there's an anxiety of what's going to happen in these people's lives. Will they be strong enough to overcome that brokenness and be able to find healing in wounds? And we know sometimes it does not work out. So those that are divorced need a special care and compassion. We have to walk that journey for them to be able to find Christ again and to be able to be open and ready and able to enter into marriage, perhaps if that's what God wants later on in life. So we see marriage in a certain sense of a brokenness. Today is a good day for us to pray for marriages. There's an African proverb about it takes a village. We often hear about this. It takes a village to raise a child. Guess what? It takes a village for us to have faithful, happy, beautiful marriages that are open to the gift of life, that are open to the gift of God's grace when there are times of trouble and difficulty. It takes a village because it takes parents, it takes the grandparents, it takes the children, it takes friends and neighbors. Support one another in marriage, because marriage is the building block of our society. We need it in order for the continuation of not just society, but the church as well. An openness to the beauty and the gift of life. And I know it's sometimes hard to realize, but guess what? Our life is not a TV show. Our life is real. And that means we're not looking at it from the outside, observing what happens. We're involved in the thick of it. And God wants us to do the best that we can in every marriage, to do the best that we can in finding the gift of His grace, in being able to, in marriage, have the spouses make each other saints one day. What a beautiful thought. Out of any responsibility that you have, if you are in a marriage, it's your responsibility to help your spouse one day be a saint. And you may look at them and say, that's a lot more than I bargained for in this world. But guess what? You too will be rewarded in heaven for that.